Well, thank you very much for your patience. Obviously, we had the typical New York City traffic delay, and I just want to let you know that Dr. Alterman is an individual who is sought after by the different groups, and he was in a function in New York City, in Manhattan, and we had to bring him over, so these things happen. I really appreciate your patience. So on behalf of the Presidential Lecture Series Committee, I'd like to finally welcome you to the 16th Presidential Lecture. These public lectures are designed to explore interesting topics while showcasing CUNY distinguished professors or national figures whose work pertains to CUNY in the fall semester and one of our own in the spring semester. Before I introduce today's speaker, permit me to thank Drs. King, Gillespie, Gray, Perel, and Karimi, who assisted me in the decision-making process. I also want to extend our appreciation to Mrs. Ronnie Weprin and Ms. Millie Conti, who have arranged the logistics for today's presentation. Now, I am pleased to present to you Dr. Eric Alterman, Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College and Professor of Journalism at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. He's also the liberal media columnist for The Nation and a fellow at the Nation Institute. He's a senior fellow and altercation web blogger for Media Matters for America, formerly MSNBC in Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the American Progress in Washington, D.C., where he writes and edits Think Again, the column. Dr. Alterman is also a senior fellow, and he has been that since 1985, at the World Policy Institute at the New School in New York. And he's a history consultant for HBO Films. He's the author of 7 books, including 2 national bestsellers. What? Liberal Media, The Truth About Bias and the News, and the book on Bush, How George W. Misled America, with Mark Green. Dr. Alterman is a frequent lecturer and contributor to numerous public publications in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. In recent years, he has also been a columnist for Worth, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, and the Sunday Express in London. He holds a PhD in history from Stanford, a master's from Yale, and a bachelor from Cornell. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Alterman to our distinguished lecture.
Usually this is somebody's job to pin this on you. Okay? Is that all right?
Yes.
Yep. Hi. Thanks for coming. I was born right, wasn't I? I grew up right around here for a very early part of my life, and I'm having all kinds of sense memories from what I'm seeing. Okay, so my talk today is called Liberty in the News, and it's taken from a book that Walter Lippmann published in 1919. I'll just go to it. Although we haven't talked about time, how long should I speak? 40? All right. Okay. I'd stop now if it was as long as I went. But it took a long time to get here. So those of you who still read a daily newspaper might have noticed last week there was a story, a kind of poignant story in the New York Times about the fate of the press room in Albany, where the state legislature is. I'll quote a little bit from that story. Desk space was once such a commodity in the cramped press quarters inside the state capitol that a special committee would convene to decide which reporters would get the coveted desks in the main room and which would be relegated to the outer offices. That committee doesn't meet much these days. It doesn't really need to. There are now just about as many vacant desks as occupied ones. One more desk was freed up last week when the New York Sun ceased publishing, becoming the 5th newspaper to exit Albany in less than 2 years. Back in 1981, the Legislative Correspondence Association, the organization of State House journalists in Albany, had 59 members from 31 news outlets. By 2001, it had fallen to 51, and the number of news organizations to 29. At the beginning of this year, could let that be a reminder to all of us. Maybe we'll take a minute. Anybody else? Okay. At the beginning of this year, there were 42 journalists and only 27 member organizations. And then they throw in the local color where this fellow Kyle Hughes says it's like tumbleweed should be blowing through here. What's most amazing about the crisis in the newspaper business right now is how it took everybody by surprise inside the business. It didn't take Wall Street by surprise. In fact, all of these newspaper companies were enjoying profit margins of 17%, roughly. That was the industry average just 3 or 4 years ago. And yet their stock prices were getting murdered. Every time a newspaper company would invest further in newspapers, its stock price would disappear. So that when McClatchy bought out a very large newspaper chain, because of the new value of that newspaper chain, it lost 90%, Knight Ridder, it lost 90% of its value of the entire organization. And this was true, that's a slightly extreme example, but not a terribly extreme example. Now, what's been happening in the newspaper business, a few things have been happening. One is that circulation has been falling, but that's actually not been the biggest problem. The biggest problem by far is that advertising is disappearing from newspapers. And everybody knows the reason for that, and that's because the internet is so much more of an effective and inexpensive way to advertise. You know, the old saying about advertising that people always used to, in business, would always say is, I know I'm wasting half my ads, I just don't know which half. Well, the thing about the internet is it allows you to see which half you're wasting. You can see exactly who's clicking on your ads. So you've already lost those portions of ads that you were getting because people didn't know what they were doing, which was half of your ads, roughly. But more significantly, the price of an ad in a digital ad on the internet is approximately 1/20th the price of an ad in a print newspaper. So you've got to have 20 times as many readers to equal that. Now, some national brand newspapers who've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the web can come pretty close to doing that. The New York Times actually has almost 20 million readers on the web compared to about 1 million readers in print. But very few can do that, and of course it's very, very expensive to build that kind of web presence. What's more, newspapers are not the best place to advertise on the web. When you think about what a newspaper does for advertisers, aside from, this talk is not really about the newspaper business per se, it's about the importance of newspapers in democracy, but just so we understand the problem. When you think about what newspapers do for advertisers is they aggregate audiences of different kinds and then present them with the opportunity to sell to all different kinds of people. But in fact, that's not what advertisers want. Advertisers want the biggest bang for their buck, and they want to target their specific consumers most effectively. They don't want to advertise to people who aren't going to buy what they sell. At least very few of them do. And it turns out that newspapers are not the best way to do that. There's other ways to reach people besides this aggregation of an entire geographical community. And so actually it's this past quarter that just passed, for the very first time, there was an absolute fall in web advertising for newspapers. There's always been, for quite a while, there's been a relative fall in terms of newspapers are losing on growth of advertising because all these new sites are coming up that are effective advertising vehicles. But this past quarter, I just read this in the newspaper yesterday, that the absolute number of dollars earned has fallen. And of course, that's for last quarter. That's before all the trouble in the stock market happened. And so it's clear, if anyone ever wondered about it, it's clear that web advertising is not going to save the news business. That's just not where it's going to come from. Now, because of the enormous reduction in advertising revenue, newspapers have had to react. The companies have had to react. The money's not coming in. They don't have the resources to pay the kinds of people to do the kinds of things that they have in the past. Now, I've made a short list of the kinds of reactions that we've seen in dealing with this problem. So far, they've included asking an already dispirited staff to take a 10% pay cut, that's the Boston Globe, raising the newsstand price by 33 to 50%, the Gannett chain and the Wall Street Journal, drastically reducing the newspaper's news advertising ratio, all Tribune newspapers, turning the paper's Sunday magazine over to the business staff, the Los Angeles Times, reducing the physical size of a newspaper and cutting down its news hole, everyone, buying out knowledgeable, experienced staff members and replacing them with underpaid novices, everyone, and closing down foreign and national bureaus, almost everyone. Virtually the only expense that's still intact in most of these places is executive pay, which averaged among the 13 publicly held newspaper CEOs at $6 million a year in 2007. According to proxy filings for the SAC, which I think we can conclude is entirely unrelated to performance. My old friend Molly Ivins said shortly before she died that newspaper companies' solution to their problem seemed to be to make our products smaller, less helpful, and less interesting. In addition to the collapse of advertising and the reduction in the number of readers, we've seen a corresponding, although not necessarily related, reduction in trust, in public trust by people who read newspapers. A recent study published by Sacred Heart University found that fewer than 20% of Americans say they could believe all or most media reporting, a figure that's fallen by about 30% in just 5 years. Less than 1 in 5 believe what they read in print, according to the 2007 State of the News Media Report issued by the Project for Excellence in Journalism. And this is across the board. There's really no different if you're talking about the New York Times or Fox News or Entertainment Tonight. There are actually far more people in America believe, that we've been visited by flying saucers, and B, that 9/11 attacks were an inside the government conspiracy, then say they believe what they read in their daily newspaper or in news at all. They also spend less time with their newspaper. That figure is down to about 15 hours a month from 30 hours a month just 10 years ago. And the most dispiriting figure of all, really, is that only 19% of Americans between the ages of 13 to 34 claim to even look at a newspaper. The average age of an American newspaper reader is 55 and rising. A scholar by the name of Philip Meyer published a book 4 years ago called The Vanishing Newspaper. He picks a day in 2043 when the very last American newspaper will be delivered to the very last American doorstep to receive one. And of course, this year there's actually a wonderful museum in Washington opened up called the Newseum, which I strongly recommend. It's a lot of fun if you're interested in newspapers, but the very idea that it's opening, there's $450 million being spent on a museum for newspapers is both poignant and weird. Now Now, again, the newspaper business itself is just another business, like the auto business or the paper business. But newspapers and the information that they provide are at the very foundation of democratic theory, and particularly of the founding of this country's Republican form of government. In an ideal republic, citizens have perfect access to their official representatives, perfect information about their actions, and perfect understanding of the issues involved. But of course, we live in an imperfect world, in a profoundly imperfect republic. The population is too large and the government too complex for anyone to keep track of everything. Given the daily scramble we all feel between jobs and families, the political ideal bears little resemblance to our reality. That's why we have a media. Protected by the First Amendment and inspired by both personal ethics and professional competition, the journalist provides the metaphorical bridge between the representatives and the represented. Almost by definition, any attempt to improve the system's accountability, therefore, requires the cooperation of the media as its messenger. Whenever any organization, be it the White House National Security Council or the Neighborhood Committee for Aluminum Recycling, seeks to gain for a particular viewpoint, its first strategic question is always the same. How do we attract media attention? And how do we manage that attention? The media, explains the philosopher Jurgen Habermas, is a political stage through which what the political scientist V.O. Key called an echo chamber is comprised that echoes the views of those speaking to, as well as the citizens' own preconceptions and prejudices as they hear those echoes. Now, judged exclusively on the basis of our own access to information as individuals, the system works pretty well. The proliferation of new avenues and forms of communication, particularly on the web, but everywhere, offers just about anyone the kind of information they need to find out what it is they want to know. On the consumer side, it's hard to argue that one can't find out what one desires to know unless it's being kept secret for some sort of national security reason between all the blogs and the New York Times and the Economist and the Weekly Star and Hard Copy and Current Affair and the New York Review of Books and whatever it is. If it's your job to find out what you need to know, you can probably find it out. The problem is not that our media doesn't serve consumers very well. The problem is that it doesn't serve the republic very well. Here's the point. James Madison argued in Federalist 10 that a republic doesn't process public opinion directly into policy. The job of the representative, instead, is to refine and enlarge public views by passing them through a medium of a chosen body of citizens. Madison reasoned that such deliberations may represent a more thoughtful form of democracy. It may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for that purpose. Speaking of the proposed Senate in Federalist 63, the father of our Constitution, James Madison, further insisted, such an institution may sometimes be necessary as defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. As the cool and deliberate sense of community ought in all governments, and actually will in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the view of its rulers, so there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterward be most ready to lament and condemn. See under war, Iraq. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. The point here is that our Republican form of government is not a democratic form of government necessarily. It has obviously elements of democracy. But the point is that it's supposed to be a deliberative form of democracy, a form of democracy that involves communication back and forth between the representatives and the represented, so that a larger form of truth is able to emerge rather than just a sort of plebiscitary truth. And that's what the framers had in mind. And that is an important role that the media are supposed to play, the role of the communicating back and forth between the representatives and the represented, between the people choosing their leaders and the leaders themselves. So it's not just a matter of providing good information. It's a very complicated process, and it's a process where you need a very sophisticated form of media that can both inform the public, but also stimulate a culture of conversation and communication to allow the highest form of truth to emerge. Now, it's not really the way that we're taught about the role of the media. We're taught basically that it's the media's job just to tell the country what their leaders are doing and let the country choose what's best. But most people who study democratic theory, or at least the practice of democracy over time, have a lot of trouble with that theory because, well, for a lot of reasons I'll get into. Perhaps the most eloquent and most blistering critics of this theory in modern time is Walter Lippmann, who, as I said, I borrowed the title of my lecture from. He published a series of 3 books between 1920 and 1924, where he basically argued that democracy was impossible, and that the fault line that made democracy impossible were the inability of the media to play the role assigned to it by democratic theory. The first of these books was called Liberty in the News. The most famous of them was called Public Opinion, which I'm sure you've heard of. That was published 3 years later in 1922. And then there was a third one called The Phantom Public, published in 1924. Lippmann was in his very early 30s when he published these 3 books. But they remain to be some of the most difficult challenges that democratic theory has ever faced. To young Walter Lippmann, the crisis of Western democracy was really a crisis in journalism. The difficulty derived from the imperfections of journalistic communication, coupled with the inability of most people to pay sufficient attention to politics. Together, these forces created a false political consciousness that Lippmann termed a pseudo-environment. In its pre-television, pre-punditocracy incarnation, this pseudo-environment consisted not simply of imperfect representations of truth, but merely reports, rumors, and guesses about it. The entire reference for political thought and action had become, in Lippmann's view, and again, this is way back in 1920, what somebody asserts, not what actually is. People under the influence of this pseudo-environment, Lippmann warned, lost their grip on the relevant facts of their environment and thus became the inevitable victims of agitation and propaganda. Again, see under Iraq, war. Lippmann argues that the social and political events which determine our collective destiny are well beyond the public's range of experience and expertise to understand. Only through incomplete, poorly comprehended media reports are these events made accessible. Public opinion is therefore shaped in response to people's maps or images of the world and not to the world itself. For the most part, Lippmann wrote, we do not first see and then define, we define first and then see. Lippmann's pseudo-environment was composed not merely of the information we receive, it also consists in equal measure of what he termed the pictures in our heads. Voters react to news in light of personal history containing stereotypes, predispositions, and emotional associations that determine their interpretations of the news. We emphasize that which confirms to our original beliefs and disregard that which denigrates or contradicts our beliefs. What emerges is a kind of polydimensional censorship. Lippmann compared the average citizen of democracy to a deaf spectator sitting in the back row of a sporting event. He does not know what is happening, why it is happening, what ought to happen. He lives in a world he cannot see, cannot understand, and is unable to direct. Reality to Walter Lippmann was something picturable, like a baseball box score or a stock market quotation. Something that's a little too vivid right now for many of our tastes. The problem with journalism, according to Lippmann, was its inability to focus the lens correctly on the more intricate manifestations of the reality that it was supposed to pass on to people. News comes from us at a distance, he complained. It comes at a distance. It comes to us helter-skelter. Journalism works fine when it can report on the score of a game or a transatlantic flight or the death of a king. But when the picture is more complex, as for example in the matter of the success of a policy, the social conditions among a foreign people, where the real answer is neither yes or no, but a subtle matter of balanced evidence, then journalism, quote, causes no end of derangement, misunderstanding, or even misrepresentation. What's more, the competition among journalistic companies, or then it was newspaper companies, but today it's all kinds of companies, drives the press to sensationalize and oversimplify the news, where the kinds of news that we really need to know goes unreported and unremarked upon. We must assume, therefore, concluded Lippmann, that the public is inexpert in its curiosity, intermittent, and that it discerns only gross distinctions, is so slow to be aroused and quickly diverted that since it acts by aligning itself, it personalizes whatever it considers and is interested only when events have become melodramatized as conflict. The danger arises when the population becomes inevitable victims of agitation and propaganda. The victor in such a system are the quack, the charlatan, the jingo, and the terrorist. Now, when Lippmann wrote his first book, Liberty in the News, he had a relatively simple solution in mind for this problem, which was just to improve the quality of journalism. He was sort of the Walter Lippmann who wrote Liberty in the News is sort of the patron saint of journalism schools. And he complained that reporting was not then a dignified profession for which men will invest the time and cost of an education, but an underpaid, insecure, anonymous form of drudgery constructed only on catch-as-catch-can principles. Merely to value the reporter in terms of his real importance to civilization would go quite a distance, in Lippmann's view, to alleviating the problem. But 3 years later, when he published Public Opinion in 1922, he had pretty much given up on that solution. He thought that journalism would never be able to create this mystical force called public opinion merely by acting on everybody for 30 minutes a day in 24 hours, when every other public institution had failed in its job to do that. Lippmann explained, along with de Tocqueville, why Madison's hope that representatives would refine and enlarge the views of their districts proved false. Thomas Jefferson may have dreamed of a well-informed citizenry of civic-minded, virtuous yeoman farmers, but in the modern era, such optimism was no longer sustainable. The problem was not merely that representatives found it easier to pander, but that they preferred the security of a false picture of the world to the difficult task of creating a more complex and daunting whole. Even if the theory were applied and districts were to send the wisest men, and the sum of combination of local impression is not wide enough a base for a national policy, and no base at all for foreign policy. Since the real effects of most laws are subtle and hidden, they cannot be understood through local experience and local states of mind, much less by this 30 minutes a day, which again, from our standpoint, is quite optimistic, 30 minutes a day. No one expects a steelworker, a musician, or a banker to understand physics, Lippmann believed. Why should they be expected to understand politics? In keeping with his Platonic inclinations, Lippmann proposed, if not a philosopher king, rather a philosophically grounded aristocracy. He argued, Lippmann believed that men did not desire self-government for its own sake. Rather, they desired it for the sake of the results. If they were presented with good government, effective government, they wouldn't really care about whether or not it was democratically derived. So the only idea he came up with was a sort of Supreme Court of politics, where you could maybe have some role in picking the people. He never actually explained how you'd pick these people, but these people would be protected from all kinds of democratic passions and so forth, and they would be given the access to the news, and they would basically run the society without any democratic interference. And you would give up on the whole idea of the way we describe our democratic system of government, or Republican form of government, which is the role of the media playing the intermediary between the leaders and the led. Just the lead would simply give up their right to play a role so long as they were well governed. That was Lippmann's impression. Now, when Lippmann published this book, The Public Opinion, which was the one that made the most impression, it was reviewed back on May 3rd, 1922 in the New Republic by John Dewey, who was already probably the most famous philosopher in America. And that review was later expanded into a book that was a reply to Lippmann's book that came out 5 years later called The Public and Its Problems. And Dewey, who was the great philosopher of democracy as well as the great philosopher of liberalism, was extremely bothered by Lippmann's indictment of democracy. He called it the most damning assessment of democracy that had ever been written up to that point. And he felt compelled to refute it. But he actually embraced much of Lippmann's critique. He agreed that voters were not omnicompetent. In other words, voters were not competent to frame policies, to judge their results, and competent to know what is for their own good. But he violently disagreed with Lippmann in the following respect, and this is very important. He didn't think that you could trust any elite to do what was best for any large group of people. A class of experts, he argued, is inevitably so removed from common interests as to become a class with private interests and private knowledge, which in social matters is no knowledge at all. Only in genuine community with the public can a government identify and respond to the public interests. An expert shoemaker knows how to best fix a shoe, but only its wearer knows where it pinches and needs fixing. Democracy must begin at home, and its home is the neighborly community. So while Lippmann was arguing from the perspective of what the scholar James Carey calls a spectator theory of knowledge, Dewey viewed knowledge as a function of communication and association. Systematic inquiry reified by Lippmann was to Dewey only the beginning of knowledge. Vision is a spectator, he wrote. Hearing is a participator. The basis of democracy, in Dewey's view, is not information but conversation and the cultivation of what might be called a culture of communication. This gets back to the argument that the founders were making about the need for deliberation. Democracy required what Dewey termed certain vital habits: the ability to follow an argument, to grasp a point of view outside of one's own, to expand the boundaries of understanding, and debate the alternative purposes that might be pursued. Habit, he argued, is the mainspring of human action, and habits are formed for the most part under the influence of customs of a group. The media's job in Dewey's conception is not to inform the public, but to interest the public in the public interest. Now, I find this debate to be incredibly both edifying and depressing. It's edifying because it's really the last great debate this country has had about what kind of democracy we're going to have. To me, it ranks just below the debate over the Constitution and the Federalist Papers in terms of this country's contribution to the history of democratic political philosophy. And a lot of people were following it. It was like a big deal. It was the kind of thing where people were really civically engaged on foundational principles, something you see very rarely today. On the one hand. On the other hand, they both won. They both won in the sense that Lippmann's criticisms of democracy were impossible to refute by Dewey. But Dewey's criticisms of Lippmann's anti-democratic principles were equally impossible to refute. And neither one had a solution to the weaknesses of their own argument. What's really interesting, and I think quite poignant about this, is that each man dedicated his own personal career to trying to, by example, solve the problem that he diagnosed. Walter Lippmann became the first important pundit in this country, political pundit, who spent the rest of his life trying to explain the policies of the government to the American people. And in fact, before Walter Lippmann and Time magazine, which started around the same time, 1924, most Americans had very little, they were not exposed to any discussions of foreign policy at all. Ironically, Lippmann fell victim to exactly the disease that Dewey diagnosed, that he became a captive of those same interests that he was supposed to be explaining, as opposed to being able to speak in the language of the people to whom he was speaking, to represent their values and interests. And he came to recognize this at the end of his life when he decided that he had been bamboozled by Lyndon Johnson with regard to Vietnam and so forth, and he ended up his life a very sort of sad fellow. Now, Dewey, of course, spent his whole life, he's famous for being, in addition to being the prophet of democracy and liberalism, also the prophet of democratic education. And Dewey devoted his life to trying to create the kind of educated populace that would be able to discuss these issues and locate its public interests, locate its values, and instruct the elite to follow those values, regardless of the fact that the elite no longer shared those values. But Dewey himself, he died when he was 92. He wouldn't ever say that he thought that this had ever been achieved. He had a very expansive idea of democracy that involved democratizing our schools, democratizing our factories, democratizing all of our institutions. Democracy was not just a political system for Dewey, it was a way of life. And the guy is actually very difficult to read. It's torture to read Dewey. But I read a lot of Dewey, and I never found any place where he claimed that any of this had been achieved in any institution in his lifetime. So they both dedicated themselves to solving the problem that they each diagnosed in this debate, and they both felt like failures when they died. And the problem is that, as I said, they were both right about the problem and both wrong about the solution. But history doesn't really worry about who's right and who's wrong. History has its own logic, and the logic of the history of the American press is that it followed largely along Lippmann's predictions rather than Dewey's. When Lippmann began writing, many newspapers remained committed to the partisan model of the 18th and 19th century American press, in which editors and publishers viewed themselves as appendages of one or another political power or patronage machine and slanted the news accordingly. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton each had their own newspapers, and they would fight with each other. They would actually write the articles themselves under pen names and attack each other when one of them was Secretary of the Treasury and the other one was Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton's newspaper, I'll just remind you, I'm sure you all know, was the New York Post. He founded the New York Post in 1801, and it's been going downhill ever since. But in part owing to Lippmann's example, the profession did just what Lippmann recommended in Liberty and the News, which is it professionalized itself. And the people who held the important positions in Washington and in the localities where the newspapers were owned became just as important and influential and respected members of society as the people they were reporting on. So that, I don't know how many people watched Tim Russert's funeral proceedings last year, but it was like a head of state had died. I mean, clearly these people, people like George Will, people like Tom Friedman, are in many ways, you could probably only pick half a dozen politicians in America that are considered as influential as these members of the press. So the press, on the one hand, it embraced a sort of scientific, what it feels is a scientific viewpoint of society based on the ideal of objectivity, of not being part of the fight, as it was in the days of Hamilton and Jefferson and for the first 100 years of the Republic. And on the other hand, it did exactly what Lippmann hoped, but Dewey feared, which is that it became part of the elite. And the people who were getting the news from the press saw it that way. So the very first reaction to this came from the far right. Following the election of 1964, followers of Barry Goldwater thought they couldn't get a fair shake from the national press. They felt that it treated them with contempt. They had a pretty good case, to tell you the truth. And they formed their own media institutions and other forms of institutions of knowledge, and they fought back. So today we have a whole world of cable news, of Fox TV, of talk radio, for God's sakes, which is entirely dominated by the viewpoint that you can't trust the national media, that the national media are deliberately deceiving you from the truth you need to know, and it's because they're all part of this elite that knows nothing about what it's like to be a real American, and if they did know, they would be contemptuous of it. And the liberals who consume their news basically were relatively satisfied with the press. I work at The Nation. The Nation wasn't so satisfied with the press, but by and large, most people who considered themselves liberal or centrist, which is not part of this conservative group, believed what it read in the New York Times and heard on CBS and NBC and ABC Evening News. And this was a disquieted minority. But this disquieted minority got stronger and stronger over time, just spending more and more money, creating more and more institutions. These institutions had a gravitational pull on the mainstream media as they had their own institutions, like I've just described, like Fox News, the Weekly Standard, but B, they were invited into the mainstream media as well, because the mainstream media, around the time Ronald Reagan got elected, started to feel nervous about his position. And so you started out with William Safire in the New York Times, and then later you got other conservatives in other newspapers, and today you have two conservatives in the New York Times op-ed page, whose primary, in the case of William Crystal, his only qualification for being in the New York Times is that he's a conservative, because he has no journalistic background, and he doesn't even believe in journalism. Before he was hired, he said that it was perfectly proper for George Bush to threaten the editors of the New York Times with jail for publishing what they published in the New York Times. Because in his view, if the government says you have violated national security, you have, completely failing to understand the role that journalism plays in keeping the government honest. Now, this colonization of important parts of the national media and gravitational pull at the same time led liberals to look at the media and say, hey, wait a minute, we thought we could trust them, but in fact we can't. And this began with the reporting of the impeachment proceedings against Bill Clinton, which people felt was quite biased on behalf of the Republicans. It grew with the reporting of the Florida debate over who was going to be president, Bush or Gore, and it absolutely exploded during the Iraq War when the media joined the government in passing along misleading information that led us to war on the basis of information that today looks very bad and should have looked very bad back then, except that the media were not interested in doing, most of the mainstream media were not interested in doing what we understand to be their job. And so the left reacted not on radio or on television, but through the internet, and created the liberal blogosphere. And the liberal blogosphere exists for two reasons. One is the Lippmannian function of trying to improve the mainstream media. A lot of the liberal blogosphere is about improving the information we get from the liberal media by holding it accountable. But the second and probably more important part of the blogosphere is this Deweyite idea of having an alternative conversation that's outside of the elite conversation, of discovering the values of the people who are not infected, who are not captured by the class values of the elite, who don't believe that the gatekeepers have a right to be the gatekeepers, who care more about the process than they do about the outcome, who care more about the fact of democracy than about the so-called quality of the news. It's not that they don't care about the quality of the news. It's that they think it's more important that their values be represented, because they think that their values are actually antithetical in many ways to the values of the elite for the reasons that Dewey described. They are wearing the shoes. They know where it hurts. So we have a situation now where the mainstream media has lost its traditional role, because it's distrusted by the right as being part of an elite for one reason, and it's distrusted by the left for being an elite for another reason. At the same time, it's less and less able to defend itself because its business model is under siege, and it can't do the things it needs to do to survive. Okay? There's no money. The New York Times spends $3 million a year minimum, maybe higher now, keeping a bureau in Baghdad. Okay? There's no advertising to pay. No advertisers care if there's a bureau in Baghdad. They care if there's a sports section. They care if there's an auto section. They care if there's an escape section. They care if there's restaurant reviews. But they don't care about Baghdad. They don't care about Africa. There's no money. That's where the whole idea of aggregation comes in. You get the sports guys and the carpet guys and all the other guys to pay for your newspaper so you can afford a $3 million a year operation in Baghdad that nobody's paying for, but that provides the democracy with the information it needs to conduct an intelligent election. You can't vote for Barack Obama or John McCain if you have no idea how things are going in Baghdad. But there's no way to pay for it anymore. There's no way to pay for it anymore. And so we're facing a situation where, in part because of its own arrogance, and in part because of the natural technological progression, that digital news is a more effective way to reach people, and in many ways actually a more effective way to deliver the news. You can get a lot more news digitally than you can on paper, that the newspapers, which are provided the basis of the society's knowledge about itself, can no longer survive. They can no longer survive. And the blogosphere is no solution to this problem, because all of the information that the blogosphere argues about comes from newspapers. 90% of the information that you hear on television and radio comes from newspapers. Newspapers are the only people, News Weekly slightly, some magazines, a few of them, but 90% is a rough estimate of all the information that permeates our society in terms of the debate we have comes from newspapers. And those newspapers are not going to survive in their present form. More than half of the newspapers will disappear, and the ones that remain will be a fraction of the size that they are. There is no end to this cutting that is going on. Nobody can see an ending to it. And this fiscal crisis, you can see, is going to result in less advertising, more cuts in newspapers, worse newspapers, fewer readers, less advertising. It's an endless cycle. Now, the newspaper business can't save itself. It's just not going to happen. The only way that this crucial piece in our understanding of democracy, regardless of whether or not you believe democracy is about information or conversation. Of course, it's about both, but you have to, to some degree, you need one more than the other, but of course it's about both. The only way this crucial piece of our democracy is going to survive is if we as a society decide that we can't afford to lose it. And then we would have to have other institutions, be they universities, be they foundations, be it the federal government. We have the federal government buying banks. It's more complicated for the federal government to buy a newspaper, and you wouldn't want the federal government to own a newspaper. You might want it to invest in the field of journalism, but you wouldn't want it to own a newspaper. But the point is that I think this problem is too important to be left to the people who own the newspapers, to the CEOs, who have so far only been able to come up with ways to make the product worse and less attractive. And I think that the longer we wait, the less there will be to save. So I feel an enormous sense of anxiety and alarm about this. I think when we all watch the debate tonight, I think we may end up feeling that we're passing through a sort of golden moment in history, believe it or not, a moment where we can actually judge what these guys are saying with some degree of accuracy, knowing what they're talking about. In the future, we will be, as Walter Lippmann warned, much more vulnerable to the jingo, the charlatan, the mayor of Wasilla, to people who want to tell us whatever they want us to believe without any ability to check its veracity, and B, any ability for us to get together and decide if we think that's where we want to go. So you're supposed to end all your talks on a hopeful note. And maybe I'll have one at the end of the questions. But I was hopeful that you would listen to my whole talk, and I feel good about that. So thanks. 40 minutes. Sure.
Obviously, one of the interesting parts about our program is the interaction between the audience and the speaker. So let's open the forum for questions and some comments if you have them. I'm certain that the question of the use of the media is forefront in mind, especially today when we have debate and your blog this morning reference to questions that we asked in the debate. And learning, somebody read the blog, and they can come.
This is a great university. We don't have continents, blog posts here.
Any questions?
I would be interested in a comment from you about the effect that you believe the media has had on this election and where it appears to stand now.
Okay. The first thing I always say on the first day of all my classes is that you're not allowed to use the word the media. Because you're not allowed to say the media is. You have to say the media are, which sounds bad but is grammatically accurate. Because media are, the word media is a plural noun. And it refers to everything. So whatever media when you say the media is, it's got to be true about some media somewhere. So you have to define your terms. And what I assume you mean is those parts of the media that make up the elite media that define the agenda for the rest of the media, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS Evening News, MSNBC, etc. It's been very interesting, I think. I wrote a long article on a cover story in The Nation a few months ago, talking about the history of John McCain and the media, pointing out that John McCain is the most beloved creature by the elite media that people were talking about since John Kennedy. Nobody's ever gotten such good press. And in fact, the press was deliberately deceptive on his behalf, that they would say all kinds of things about him that could be easily disproven, but they liked him. And there was the details, they didn't sweat the details. Barack Obama got, most people think he got great press. I think he got pretty good press for a while, and then that ended pretty quickly. He got a lot of press, which is very different than getting good press. Now, when McCain picked Sarah Palin, he threw it all away on purpose. Part of picking Sarah Palin was declaring war on the media. That's what they did. That whole Republican convention set up the media as the enemy, the filter. He was going to go beyond them. And he threw away, I mean, he had a party. I actually went to a party for McCain where he called the media, the elite media, his base. He was kidding, but he wasn't kidding. The party was thrown by Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live. You know, it's a very odd thing for a Republican. And he was in a great position to run a centrist campaign and rely on people's uncertainties about Obama and his level of experience. But instead, he decided to run a hard right campaign, and he turned the people who loved him against him. They had no choice. So all of the people who were acting as sort of public relations people for McCain have now turned on him. And he's run this hard right campaign that looks a lot like George Bush's 2004 campaign, but it's a very different country and a very different circumstances. And Barack Obama is a much better candidate than John Kerry was. So it's a complete failure. But I would say that even though I think the media have turned against McCain personally, I think he's still, the issues, the way the media defines them, are still defined in a very conservative way. They're still defined. The first debate on foreign policy, well, the first part of the first debate was all about the fiscal crisis, but it was all about what are we going to cut? What can you not afford anymore? It wasn't about what new investments do we have to make to deal with this situation. It was conservative Republican economics was the underlying assumption of the questions. Ditto with foreign policy. What are you going to do about this military threat? What about Russia? What about Iran? What about Iraq? What about Pakistan? It wasn't about what about global warming? What about the problem of migration? What kinds of new cooperation? What about the problem of China and India and the American worker who no longer can make anything like what he's used to getting paid? And what about the problem of protecting our communities' environments in light of the fact that if they don't protect them in China and India, then our products are going to cost more? Those are, I think, just as important security questions, but they're defined as outside, they're soft questions. They're not important in terms of our debate. So I think that the media are still defining the terms of debate in very conservative terms, even though McCain has made himself very unpopular, and you can certainly see that.
Your take on public broadcasting.
Yeah, well, one thing I always try and impart to my students is that our model is not the only model of how you organize the media. It's a commercial model, and it's failing now. But a commercial model has always been problematic because you're dependent on your advertisers for your health, and your advertisers and your owners don't always want certain things reported, and those things might be things that people need to know. So NBC is not really the best place to get information about the nuclear energy industry or the nuclear weapons business because it's owned by GE. You don't turn to MSNBC for information about Microsoft, unless it's good news. In other countries like Britain, they have a different model, which is much more heavily publicly supported. The average British person pays about $250 a year for the BBC. We pay about $1.13 a person for PBS and NPR. And it's a very expensive $1.13 when you think about all of the arguments that goes on about it whenever there's anything on it that people object to. And that $1.13 is not enough to support PBS and NPR. And so they're forced to raise private monies from the same places and are subject to the same pressures that commercial TV is. So we have a kind of schizophrenic view, I would say, towards public broadcasting, the very idea of public broadcasting, and it's reflected in the fact that even though we're by and large a wealthier country than Britain, we pay 1/200th of what they pay to create, to inform ourselves. And we don't do a very good job of protecting those institutions from being buffeted by political winds. I'm glad you brought it up, because this is something that if we're going to save the kind of journalism I'm talking about, we're going to have to get over. As I said, there's no way to save it from a business standpoint. We have all the great minds in the business have been trying to figure out how to save the business. They don't have anything. And now we're losing. They're not even improving the amount of ads they're getting online, which is the very first step that they have to take. If they can't do that, they can't do anything. So we have to say, as a society, we want to find a way to support this kind of journalism. And the model of public broadcasting is actually the model that we have now, and that's a very weak model. So we need to find a new way to do this. And like I said, I think that the lead has to come from universities and foundations, but there's a lot of problems with that too that I can talk about. Sir.
I do a great deal of reading, and I rarely read inside the box. I believe that if you're going to be informed in the United States, you have to read publications and watch programs that are outside the box, because I feel that an incredible amount of news is suppressed and not even reported. And in fact, the New York Times won't review certain books, like Vincent Bugliosi's book about the trial for murder of George W. Bush. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'm of two minds about this. As I said, I think you can, if you read The Nation and you read the blogosphere, you can find out pretty much anything, I think. Sometimes you need Cy Hirsch, to find things out. Some things are really hard to find out, and because there's real value in keeping them quiet. But mostly, I think we have a kind of censorship from the standpoint of what the media decide to pay attention to, not to censor. So that there's an awful lot of nonsense. I mean, tonight, Bill Ayers will be a very big issue. And it's hard to argue that that's a big issue, Obama was 8 when those bombings took place and living in Indonesia. Even if this 8-year-old Indonesian kid had approved of such bombings, which I'm pretty sure is not the case, I don't think it would matter very much in terms of what kind of president he'll be at age 48. And yet, an awful lot of attention will be devoted to that issue, and an awful lot of things will go ignored as a result thereof. The media are like a dinosaur with a really tiny brain, and they beat their tail around and do a lot of damage, and they ignore a lot of things that are right in front of their face. The solution to that is to demand a better media. That's the Deweyite solution, but it's not one that we've been very successful at implementing, and I don't exactly know how to do it.
With Bob McChesney and the Free Press Media?
Sure.
Because I go to those media conferences and they're terrific.
Yeah, no, they are. I work with Bob sometimes. And I have a whole list of sites. If you go to my website, Altercation, there's a whole list of sites which I think are the kind of sites you would like and provide alternative sources of information. My friend Josh Marshall has created his own little media empire which reports with alternative sources and alternative ideas on things that the mainstream media ignores, and has actually forced a lot of changes in what they've reported on the issues that he's focused on. It can be done. They are responsive to pressure, but until recently, the pressure has all come from the right side of the spectrum, and they've had great success in changing the way the media think about things. And like I said, they respond to pressure. It's called working the refs, and the side that I happen to be on hasn't been as effective at that. Although the organization that funds my website, Media Matters, that's just why they exist. So I think there's been some equalizing, but in my view, not enough. I'm sure a conservative would disagree. Well, let's take two. There's two right here.
Where do all these alternate media get their information from, since they obviously can't afford to keep their correspondents all over the world, like the Times can't afford?
Right. Well, in two ways. One is you just read the same story and think about it differently because you have a different point of view. So if George Bush says we did X because of Y, and you don't think George Bush is likely to tell you the truth, you think about other reasons why they might have done X, and you check it out and see if you can verify that. That's what most of the blogosphere does. They just give alternative explanations for the same information that the mainstream media, with which the mainstream media provides them. Now, again, my friend Josh has this, Josh Marshall's Talking Points Media. He's actually pioneered a whole new model of information gathering, which it can't really be done, I don't think, on that large a scale. He does it on a rather small scale. But he's created a whole community of sources, of people, interested people with expertise in different issues. And when he addresses an issue, people write him in with information. So he's got people inside the government and inside these corporations, and just who have simple expertise, like in universities and places like this, who say, actually, when they're saying this is really what they're saying. And if you read his reporting on Katrina, for instance, it's not just his reporting on scandals, but his reporting on Katrina. He was getting people inside the government, not the spokespeople who the New York Times goes to. The New York Times goes to the assistant secretary for, public relations. He'll talk to the experts at mid-level, and they'll give him a new way to understand it. And because he and the people who work around him have an alternative mindset, that it opens up a whole new world. Now, if you get enough evidence, you can force the mainstream media to respond to that, just purely on the basis of evidence. You can't force them to change their mind about how to think about that until you have a critical mass. So, as I said, even though most of the world and even most Americans understand that global warming is real and it's a big problem and it requires international cooperation of a kind that we've never had except maybe in wartime, there wasn't a single question about it in any of the presidential debates. There were no questions in any of the presidential debates about any of the wiretapping that George Bush has done. Not one of all there were ABC, George Stephanopoulos and Charlie Gibson were demanding to know, why are you talking about not lowering the capital gains tax, which 95% of American people don't pay, or taxes for people making $200,000 or more. That's the figure that 95% of people pay. Capital gains tax, more people pay, but not very much. And yet not a single question about wiretapping, no questions about torture, no questions having to do with the Constitution at all, really. Without the Constitution, we've had an enormous expansion of constitutional power in the presidency. So that's, again, why the blogosphere is so wonderful in this Deweyite sense. But it hasn't had the power that the right wing had, which was to force the mainstream media to respond to its concerns. It has to become stronger and more savvy in order to be able to do that. You had a question? That'll be the last question.
What is your opinion of the media's part in the initial acceptance of the American public in the Iraqi war?
Oh, well, people have written books about that. It's a complicated issue. The media, again, you could find in the media all the information you needed to know that they didn't have good evidence for weapons of mass destruction, that there was no verifiable relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and that Saddam Hussein had not committed any acts of terrorism for the past 10 years and none against the United States. You could find that out. I knew that because I read mainstream media sources. But what they were reported on page A17. They were not discussed by the networks. None of the cable stations talked about them. There was a sense that it was that because we had been attacked, and it didn't matter the fact that we were attacked by somebody else. The fact that we were attacked made everybody in the media very uncomfortable even raising these questions about Bush's power. The Elizabeth Buehler of the New York Times White House correspondent said that she was afraid to ask the president tough questions at a press conference. She was personally afraid to do it. Now my picture was up there. Bill O'Reilly had me like in a mugshot because I said I didn't think we would be welcomed as liberators by the people we were invading. That's all I said. I said I didn't think it. I don't know. I don't think so. And I had to endure that. Well, I don't really mind enduring that. It's actually good for business in some ways, in the business I'm in. But most journalists don't need that kind of attention. They need to be able to prove that they're objective and trustworthy. And you couldn't go wrong reporting what the government said. It's like you buy IBM, because you can't get in trouble for buying IBM. If you buy something else and think something goes wrong, it's your fault. If you buy IBM and something goes wrong, well, you bought IBM. That's the easy thing to do. So there was no incentive inside the system to question the official version, and there were lots of incentive not to. Now, what reporters say today, which I think is completely wrong, is they say, well, they don't create opposition, they report on opposition, and they couldn't find any opposition. Well, that's just a lie. Al Gore gave a great speech against the war at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. Ted Kennedy gave a great speech. General Anthony Zinni, who was head of the Central Command, gave a strong statement against the war. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, strong against the war. There were a lot of very credible sources who were against the war, but they were treated as outliers. They were never treated as serious. And in fact, right up until the war began, the country was basically evenly divided. So even though you had the entire force, you had 9/11, you had the force of the entire government, and you had 80% of the media, and you still only had a country that was pretty evenly divided. I think that's a very impressive statement about American democracy. Democracy is a very imperfect mechanism for governing a country. A democracy of 300 million people can't really do it. And our political conversation vastly lags behind the people, in my view. So that when we impeached Bill Clinton, on the day that he was impeached, he had a 68% approval rating. 3 times the approval rating that George Bush has today, who hasn't been impeached, by the way. Over and over, I could pick out, if you think about, I'm not taking a position on whether or not I support free trade or not, okay? It doesn't matter. But can you think of a single pundit in any major newspaper who doesn't support free trade? I actually can think of one. Pat Buchanan. He's on television. But yeah, Pat Buchanan from the reactionary right, okay? Now, in the 2006 election, every single seat that turned over from Republican to Democrat or independent turned over from someone who had a softer trade policy to a tougher trade policy. There were a lot of elections where both people opposed the war, like in Rhode Island. Both senators opposed the war. But without exception, the person who was less sympathetic to free trade beat the person who was sympathetic to free trade if that seat turned over. And if you read the opinion polls, strong majorities think we should have a tougher policy on trade. There's not a single pundit. There's one at the Washington Post. There's Pat Buchanan, who's, crazy. There's Lou Dobbs, who's also crazy. There's no one at the New York Times, no one at the LA Times who questions this policy at all when it's a majority view of the United States public. So the public discourse lags behind the public itself in many ways. It's this Dewey problem of they represent the views of the elite and are not even aware really of the views of the larger public. It's never going to be solved, but we can make it more difficult for them to live in this fantasy world. And I think the Obama election is in fact about that, because one of the reasons that there hasn't been the groundswell within the media for Obama that people think there has is because Obama's election is in many ways a rebuke to the media. Obama was right about the war. Obama never supported the war. They're all saying the position of most people in the mainstream media is, yes, we were wrong about the war, but we were right to be wrong. Based on what we knew at the time, based on the information that was available, we were right. It just has turned out badly. We didn't realize how incompetent the Bush administration was, and we believed when they said that they were threatening us. Obama didn't fall for any of that. He says, no, I knew that this was a stupid idea, and you guys were wrong, and I was right, and the people who agreed with me were right. That's very difficult for the media to swallow, because it was the central issue of our time. And from that, an awful lot of things follow. So I think, you know, obviously I'm not a fan of George Bush, and obviously I would have preferred, say, Hillary Clinton to George Bush or to John McCain. But with Obama, you actually have a completely qualitative change in the thinking about government, about these large issues. It's going to be a very different world under Obama than it would have been under Hillary Clinton. And I don't know if it's how well it's going to work out, but I think it's very interesting. It's kind of like finally getting rid of those old guys in the Soviet Union and, you know, looking at things anew. We're entering a new era, assuming that the polls are correct. And I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I'm very excited for her to be alive during it, because I haven't lived through anything like this in my life.
Well, thank you very, very, very much. Before you run for the exits and go to the reception and have a private, quiet time with Dr. Alterman, let me tell you, and I cannot help myself, I have to say this. Obviously, what we have been talking about is the informed public and how that public is informed. I want you all to realize that 50% of all undergraduate students attending college in this country today are attending a community college. And I want you to know that in many community colleges, the emphasis on critical thinking, historical context, and an ability to communicate is not taught. You are taught to be trained, you're trained to do a job. And I think that what you have been talking about today can be a tremendous tsunami of ignorance as we go forward in the development of this country. We need to do something about educating the populace. And of course, I'm getting into Dewey's area here, but we really need to get into that discussion. So I think that what you have done for us today, Dr. Alterman, is you have brought to us a 30,000 feet view of what is important about the educational process in this country in terms of general education, and I really appreciate your time and your words. Also, before you start running for the exits, let me also tell you that in the spring, and I don't remember the date, but it's going to be in April or March. One of the members of the committee can, if you remember, quickly tell me. We're going to have one of our own, Dr. Jean Morley, and the topic of that discussion is going to be extremely interesting. She just published a book. It's called True Crimes, and I think it's the American, or the influence of American thinking. And it's about the true crime novels that were in the early part of the century and how they have influenced our thinking. I think it's a great book. I always been taking 10% of the royalties of the book. It's a joke, but I invite you to keep your eyes and ears open for the date for the presidential lecture for this spring, which will be Dr. Jean Morley. Dr. Alterman, thank you very much.
I'm a great fan of Bill Moyers.
So am I.